Okay, everybody. This video lecture is going to cover chapters 5 and 6 of Maher's book, Plant Minds. So in our class on Monday, we got to the end of chapter 4. We got to the end of our discussion of the question of whether or not plants have memory. And we talked about the idea that it's highly plausible that plants have a capacity to encode, store, and retrieve information. And even though that information is not structured in such a way that it could be robustly construed as being an instantiation of the three canonical forms of memory that we discussed, procedural memory, semantic memory, and iconic memory, even so, there's a sense in which this kind of information processing protocol might be construed as a kind of working memory, especially given that the information capacities that we just assessed seem to be in the service of animating a certain type of action that the plant is perhaps capable of. Maybe these plants are agents. That's the topic of the 5th chapter on action. So right off the bat, it's important that we distinguish between voluntary and involuntary actions on the one hand, and then Maher does a nice job of also talking about certain cases that are unclear. It's not obvious what kind of actions they are. So the voluntary actions are things like walking, writing, playing hockey. Involuntary actions are salivating, digesting, and aging. And then the unclear ones are things like stretching and yawning. And the reason they're unclear is because they don't involve any planning or robust intention, but they are under some degree of our control. So what we really care about in attributing agency to plants is the question of whether or not plants have the capacity for voluntary actions. And Maher says on page 100, and this is the middle of page 4 of your handout, that plants appear to initiate things on their own and for their own good. And that can tempt us to say that they are not just active, but that they act voluntarily. So the reason that we might want to deny action to plants is because they still don't seem to have representations. And that's the resounding theme through every chapter. And unfortunately, the attribution of intentional action, voluntary action to plants, looks like it might succumb to the same worry, because you might think in order to be able to have a voluntary action, you have to be able to represent a goal. You need to explicitly have a goal in mind which guides the behavior. Not clear that plants are able to do that. But this is the stage where we might think actually there is hope here. Because if you think about the way we act, even voluntary actions, we are actually capable of many different types of actions. And most importantly of all, a lot of our actions seem to go on in a skillful way, in a fluid way, without any explicit representations, without the capacity to use pictures or words or models or maps. So think about expert, absorbed, skillful action. That kind of action doesn't look like it's under the influence of explicit representations. And if that's right, then perhaps we can say of plants that they have a kind of voluntary action that isn't under the guidance of representation. So if it's possible to have explicit voluntary actions that are not guided by representations of goals or outcomes, then maybe we can say of plants that they have action. And this is how he's going to argue in the last chapter, where he gets to his discussion of inactivism and representationalism. So he begins that chapter, and I give you a quote on the bottom of page 4, top of page 5, where he enumerates some of the things that plants are able to do, the various actions that they're able to take. And then he notes that, look, we as human beings, we do all this sophisticated action without consciously or unconsciously thinking about things. Now, here's a trick. This is an objection right now we have to consider, right? It's true that human beings explicitly act and intentionally act without being explicitly guided by thought or any active representation that we can note. But in talking about thought, Maher elides the distinction between representation at the level of perception and representation at the level of thought. And he definitely doesn't countenance the distinction between perceptions being imagistically representational versus propositionally representational. And that's some distinctions that we talked about previously. And so it's important to note that you might think that even for skillful absorbed action, there is some kind of perceptual representation going on that's constantly updating as we get new information. So it's not a knockdown argument. Even so, we should take the inactive proposal very seriously, for it is itself a serious view and a serious proposal is on the table. And so we get another restatement of inactivism, which is that it is the claim that to have a mind is not necessarily to harbor representations, pictures, words, models, maps of a world outside oneself, but is to disclose, bring forth, or enact a world of things that have significance, a meaning, or a value. Now, if you want to understand what it means to bring forth a world of significance, again, think of the way the beaver's manipulation of its environment transforms that environment into something uniquely well suited to its needs. All organisms do this. All organisms interact with their environments and thereby transform their environments into niches that are well suited to the organism's needs. Just as environments exercise pressures on the organism which the organism must adapt to. Evolution in this way is a kind of commingling of organism and environment. The influence isn't just one way. It's not just the world putting selection pressure on organisms. The organisms also manipulate and transform their environments through their application of agency. Okay? So here's another key passage from the text, and what we're going to do is we're going to read this passage, extract some arguments, consider some objections. Okay? So here's the passage. The passage reads as following. Inactivism holds that to have a mind is to enact or disclose a value-laden world, an environment or a niche, an array of things that matter in various ways. It contends further that all living things do just that. Through their activities, they bring forth or disclose an array of things that matter in various ways. They manage to do that because they are effectively in response to conditions that affect their viability. Being autopoietic, self-creating, and adaptive, intelligently and differentially responsive to the primes of the environment, discloses a value-laden world, a milieu, or niche. This is not a value-neutral space, but a field of things that have significance, opportunities, and threats, things that help and hinder the continuation of the self. So, and in a form of an argument lifted from the book, autopoiesis and adaptivity suffice for having a mind. Plants are autopoietic and adaptive, therefore plants have minds. Now, of course, the contentious premise here is the first premise, the idea that autopoietic adaptivity is enough for minds. But we might also object to the second premise, that plants are autopoietic and adaptive. You might think that you can be autopoietic and adaptive to differing degrees, and that there's a threshold of adaptivity and autopoiesis that's necessary in order to count as having a mind. I'll break that down for you in a minute. Maher then considers 5 objections to this argument. Right? The first one is the objection, dumb life. This is basically the objection that life isn't that smart and we shouldn't attribute so much agency to it. There's a lot of just unconscious reaction happening. His response to that is pretty rote, right? He's going to say, well, look, like it's not as dumb as you think it is. Look at the actual behavior. Look at what they're actually capable of. It's incredible. They're incredibly adaptive. We should not think of them as dumb. They're highly adaptive, intelligent systems. Deceptive appearances. You're anthropomorphizing. You're projecting mental structures of the human experience onto the plant. Maybe we are. But it's not that obvious, given the complexity of their behavior. Denying differences. You're denying the relevant differences between humans and plants. In particular, plants can't represent things. But maybe we don't need to represent things to have minds. I'm not going to go through all the objections because I actually think they're not the strongest objection. Maher does not entertain the strongest, most nuanced objection to his view. And that's what we're going to do now in the brief time that we have left. I'm not going to waste too much of your time today. I want you to spend most of the time off working on your term papers. But before I let you go to do that, let's think about the most devastating objection that we can to Maher's view. It's what I call over-attribution. So Maher makes the following claim. He claims that, quote, this is the top of page 6 of the handout, to have a mind is to have or create a world of things with meaning for oneself, and autopoiesis and adaptivity suffice for exactly that. Another quote. By highlighting the connection between autopoiesis and adaptivity and the disclosure of an Umwelt, a meaning world, a world of meaning, more than mere space, inactivism makes it plausible that plants and other organisms have minds. But here's the question you have to ask yourself. Do plants have an Umwelt? Do they have a life world? What does it mean, and I'm quoting here, to have or create a world of things with meaning for oneself? This suggests that the plant has a sense of self for which and to which a meaningful world is disclosed. But it's already been clearly acknowledged that the plant does not have the kinds of mental states that are complicated enough to represent a world as seeming a certain way to it. Because if things seem a certain way to you, then they have to be accessible for accuracy conditions. But all the plant has is differential behavioral response with informational covariation within itself and within its environment. Okay? But if the plant has a world in view, if the plant has a meaningful world that's disclosed to it, that is enacted to it, doesn't that mean that its view on the world could be better or worse? And if it has a view on a world that could be better or worse, then that is going to be representational in some way, in the sense that it has an intentional relation to the world, that the world is disclosed or portrayed to it seeming a certain way, and that whether that seeming is accurate or not, it will be something that we can evaluate. But we've already acknowledged at every stage of the book that plants don't have mental content that is that complex. So it becomes unclear to what extent we can say of an autopoietic system that it has a world in view. It might react to a world. It might be differentially responsive and sensitive to a world. It might be perturbed by a world and feel the impact of that world within its body. And I would be happy to say that that's a mind. But it's not clear that the language of world disclosure is an accurate way of talking about what the plant is up to, precisely because it's already been acknowledged that the plant does not have the kinds of mental states that are complex enough for the world to seem a certain way to it. And if the world doesn't seem a certain way to one or to an organism, then it's not clear that we can say of that organism that it has a world in view. So there is a sense in which I think Maher's given us enough material to say that plants might have minds. You might think that the plant's actions and the plant's capacity to respond to what's happening to it is enough to attribute a kind of internal feeling to the plant, and that feeling motivates the plant's actions. But it's not clear that the plant has a robustly meaningful world before it. It's clear that the plant is responding to stimulus in an intelligible and perhaps intelligent way. And maybe that's enough. But I think the language of the life world, the Umwelt, the enaction of a world of meaning is too robust and strong because it tacitly invokes intentionalistic representational language that's relevant to the attribution, and which the author has at several stages in his argument previously acknowledged is not a reasonable thing to attribute to the plant. Okay, so that was very short, only about 15 minutes. Normally we meet for a lot longer than that, but because you're not there to have a conversation with me about it, I'm not going to waste your time with an overly long lecture. What I will encourage you to do is to go back over the 5 objections that Maher levels in his chapter and responds to, and compare the strength of those objections to the objection that I just leveled. And then you should see if you can think of an objection to, or whether you like the argument, and think about that. But truly, the most important thing for you to be up to right now is to be working seriously on your term paper. so that you can have a working, clean draft of the paper done well in advance of the deadline so that you can edit it a few times before you submit it for grading. So, for next time, Wednesday, November the 13th, when we meet, you will need to have read chapter 4 of Arthur Reber's book. It's on the PDF is on the La Lima website, and you will need to read Beginnings and chapter 1 of Antonio Damasio's The Strange Order of Things. And then from here on out, we're just going to read Damasio's book very carefully and talk about it. I will continue to provide handouts, but I'm going to limit those handouts. They're going to be shorter, and my expectation and hope is that we can just have a conversation about what's going on in the book, because it's really well written. It's a pleasure to read, and there's a lot of really cool ideas in it. So gear up for that, write your term papers, and I'll see you on Wednesday, November 13th.